When we wrote the book, A Tragic Beginning, one of our early chapters described the whole Japanese period of colonial rule. And it's clear that in that 50 years, Chinese society or Taiwanese society was radically changed. And particularly by 1936, 37, 38, when the Japanese pushed their assimilation policy to turn every Taiwanese or Chinese into a Japanese citizen, that made a big impact on a lot of young people. So the value changes that occurred for many younger Taiwanese people were very complicated. I mean, many of them had a very ambiguous view toward the Japanese, a love-hate relationship. Others admired them greatly for the way they've been able to modernize Japan and modernize Taiwan. And then there were others, of course, who still clung to the Chinese heritage and did not like the Japanese at all. So you had produced a very complicated, a much more complex society by 1944-45 than what existed in 1895. So when the Chinese nationalists come to Taiwan, they have spent several years preparing how they're going to take it over. They thought they had done a pretty good job of collecting information, setting up a government that would be put in place very quickly, training police, training civil servant officials, and so forth. But all of their efforts were far below what was really necessary to try to help Taiwan get back on its feet, plus win the support and loyalty of the Taiwan people itself. But they had no idea how difficult and formidable their task would be. They didn't realize, I don't think, that very few Taiwanese could communicate with this new government and its military people and its civil affairs officials. So there was a huge language gap, and there was also a big cultural gap. And you had people from China, of course, coming to Taiwan with a big chip on their shoulder. For example, these people would complain that the people in Taiwan had never fought the World War II against Japan. They had never been involved in the Kangjan, the struggle against Japanese imperialism and brutality. It had been Chinese blood that was sacrificed in mainland China. People in Taiwan were helping the Japanese and getting through the war period in a pretty good way. So a lot of people from mainland China came over with that kind of resentment a little bit in their hearts, thinking that, gee, these Taiwanese didn't suffer like we did, and all these Japanese properties and wealth around here, we're going to help ourselves to a little bit of it to make up for what we suffered. Well, these factors and many others explain largely why within several months there was enormous bitterness and anger and resentment on a growing number of Taiwanese toward the mainland. And many mainlanders reciprocated this by also complaining and expressing their biases and anger about the Taiwanese who had lived under Japanese rule and hadn't really made much of an effort to fight the Japanese, and in fact who had even gone to war and joined Japanese regiments and had served in battle in South and Central China. So all the conditions were there for a big confrontation and ultimately some violence. But as I as I pointed out to you earlier, much of that anger and bitterness that was boiling inside so many Taiwanese, particularly urban Taiwanese, educated Taiwanese, younger Taiwanese, in spite of that, the government was able to sort of calm things down for a short period in the spring of '46, when they carried out island-wide provincial and local elections. And the Taiwanese were able for the first time to really have an election and choose their representatives. They had had elections beginning around the early and mid-30s, but these were very limited kinds of elections. Anyway, the election did calm down things a little bit, but by summer and the fall, inflation was worsening, and all kinds of events were festering, and the growing bitterness was observed by so many and reported in various ways. So that when the explosion did come, it was precipitated by a lot of anger on the part of Taiwanese on February 28th and 29th itself, and quickly the Taiwanese were setting up what was called these resolution committees in the cities to impose order and to try to set up some kind of liaison with each other and to try to get together and work out some sort of an agreed upon set of rules by which the Taiwanese could deal with the Chinese nationalists on the mainland. And here there were big arguments that went on for several weeks, carried out by the resolution committees, holding all kinds of ongoing sessions, particularly in Taipei, but all through the island they were doing this. So that ultimately the Taiwanese were staking out several positions, some very radical, a total break with the mainland, others a little bit more moderate in the sense that they wanted some autonomy, but they didn't want to break. And that was the situation that was taking place in those few weeks after the violence had broken out across the island's major cities. And then the landing of nationalist troops in Keelung, fanning out, going to the central and southern areas, and quickly imposing in the most brutal way their martial law, was pretty horrendous. Taiwanese had never seen this kind of brutality. They were shocked and stupefied by it, and in fact, I think just reduced to a state of awful anger and total shock. Many people fled the island and went to Japan, some to the United States, as you know. And very quickly then, Chunyi was replaced and normalcy was restored. But terrible damage had been done because a number of a very distinguished Taiwanese elite had been brutally killed without any kind of legal system at all, and the damage had been done. And so what you were left with, I think, in Taiwan was a kind of a spectrum of different elite views as to how people should try to get along with this new government. Many Taiwanese looked at this new government, as Lee Donghui would tell a Japanese journalist, as a new colonial regime. They had just gotten rid of one colonial regime. Now suddenly they had to deal with another colonial regime. Now that was a strong point of view that was put out by various intellectuals, wealthy merchants, elites. There were other Taiwanese, people like Guo Guoji, Li Wanju, people like that who were elected, who later were elected by Taiwanese constituents because they were so well known, and they were willing to work within the system of the nationalist government, and they would do that. Others who had been reformers during the late Japanese colonial period, people like Lin Xiantang, Han Shitran, these people had opposed Japanese rule, but they did it in, again, living within the system, trying to produce reforms that the Japanese might be persuaded to adopt, but that was rarely the case. Finally, you had, I think, a position that eventually a lot of Taiwanese elite bought into, and that was to work for the Nationalist Party goals, but also to try to get the Taiwanese view expressed as much as they could. People like Wang Chao-chin, who was elected as the first Taiwan provincial governor, I believe, in the spring of 1946. Others like him, I suppose, would be regarded as collaborators by many of the Taiwanese people who had suffered and who had a lot of hatred in their heart for the KMT itself, but would come to terms with that government and do the best they could to educate their children and take advantage of the market economy and so forth. So out of that horrible tragedy, you had a number of Taiwanese who resolved to work within the system and do the best they could that way. Those that could not fled the island and simply joined political parties in Japan and in the United States and tried to carry on the battle that way. And still others, of course, were perished in the aftermath of Ba, and those who had struggled against the Japanese were already in their late years and would not live very long to see the new regime develop a new order on Taiwan. So the nationalist government decided that the way to handle this problem was never to mention it. Don't teach it in the school books. Just forget it ever happened and hope that the people would have historical amnesia. If it was mentioned, if it was ever brought up, the standard argument would always be blame it on the communists. And that's basically what the Chinese nationalist position was in dealing with Ba. I think until our book came out and until the commission was set up by Li Donghui, I believe around, I'm not sure the exact date of that, but I think it was around 1995, 6 or 7, in one of those years. And that was the way the nationalists decided to deal with Ba. Sweep it under the table. If it did come up, blame it on the Chinese communists or Taiwanese communists, and continue to hammer home the point that the nationalist government was trying to build a new democracy and a new market economy on Taiwan that would make everybody happy and proud to be Guomin, or citizens of the Republic of China. And finally, when Li Donghui decided to set up the commission to explore the causes and to make an official apology, Many people, like myself, I think, thought that, well, finally the matter has been resolved. Taiwan now would very quickly have a two-party government, and there would be a turnover of power to the opposition in the year 2000, and that's exactly what happened. It's a complicated situation now, and it's hard to say how it's going to turn out. I think my presentation of Ba is not too far from the truth. People might scholars who have looked into the problem might quarrel about the way our book handled certain personalities and what they did and this and that. But I don't think the fundamentally broad picture would be altered very much. I think there's an objectivity and there's an attempt there to see the events leading up to and through Ba in their historical context and with the complex events that were going on. Yeah, Kerr, of course, later became a very strong champion of Taiwan nationalism. And his book was the only book for many decades that said anything at all about Ba. Well, I think the main reason that it was the only book for many decades was that it was very hard for people to go to Taiwan to study that problem, carry out interviews, and try to get historical information because of martial law and the nationalist government's strong point of view that they didn't want to see Ba discussed at all. When we began to research it in the very late 80s, government people were changing their views toward it, and they thought the time had come to have an objective study of Ba. That's how we were able to sort of go about it and collect information. So the main reason then that the Kerr book was the only book was because of the unhospitable conditions in Taiwan to really carry out the research to produce an objective scholarly account. Well, Kerr never had any, Kerr was not able really to kind of detach himself from the Taiwan point of view and the Taiwan experience, which he lived through, by the way. He was there at that time as a consul general, I think, as in Taiwan. And it was just hard for Kerr to detach himself from that point of view and take a look at the world that the nationalist government saw. I mean, if you're going to write about Chun-Yi, for example, which we tried to do in a very concise way, you had to, you have to look at Chun-Yi in an objective way and see his good points and his bad points. And this is what we tried to do. The same with Jiang Jieshi. The same with other people who come through the book.
So you would say that it's written strongly from a Taiwanese perspective?
I would say that it is written that way. Yes, this is simply, and this is basically true. But there are good reasons for it, and Kerr always believed that the Taiwanese had gotten a very bad rap. And they did at Ba, in terms of the way that it was suppressed, in terms of the way in which people were tried and imprisoned, and in terms of just sweeping the event away from ordinary people's eyes. I mean, one could justify that the nationalist government did this because they were in a life and death struggle with the communists, and many of them deluded themselves, many officials deluded themselves into believing that Urba was the product of communist conspiracy to seize Taiwan, as the nationalists were trying to set up a base there, a base of resistance there. So I'm not passing moral judgment on these things. I'm just telling you what these different points of view were and why people behaved the way they did. I'm trying to say that our book is brutally objective, I think. Very objective.
How do you think your book would be received by people from
That you've been interviewing and are very, very, very contemptuous of mainlanders and what the KMT has done? They would probably dismiss it and say this is not true. I would hope they would pause and think about it and try to see that history is complicated and there are different sides of people at different historical events. That's the way history is. I mean, we say in the book that the suppression was brutal, and we make no way of condoning it.
Do you make references to the Kerr book in your
I think we mention it several times, surely. We don't do things to compare with the Kerr book or anything like that. We try to write this just straightforward. It tries to be basically, much of the book is a day-to-day account of what happened until the rebellion, until the upheaval or the uprising, as I would call it, because it was an uprising. It was a spontaneous uprising. It wasn't planned or contrived or organized. It became organized more and more through the resolution committees until it was brutally suppressed. Well, you know, as I said in my general summary, after the night of 27th, on the 28th, 29th, and several, you know, I don't know how many days for sure, because it was the mainlanders who were getting the brunt of the anger and resentment of the Taiwanese. But that calmed down. That calmed down, I would say, certainly within 5, 6, 7 days or close to a week.
Civilians or military?
Oh, I think it was largely civilians.
Could you describe some of these?
Well, I think in the book talks about people in trains being beaten up, people who were out on the morning of the 28th would be attacked. People would write nasty comments about the mainlanders across. Banners would go up saying nasty things about the nationalist government officials and so forth. In fact, the military just stayed out of the way, went back to their barracks, and were ordered to not get involved. But you know, roughly after that 2-week period, when the troops from Shanghai came, then the whole atmosphere turned upside down into terror and horror, both. We don't have that kind of I don't recall that being written up in the book, and if it was written up, or if somebody does claim it to be true, then it was obviously part of that flood of information that has come to the surface or come out to the public after Lee Dong-Hui set up the commission to try to get to the truth of that affair. Well, the people who roughed her up were the monopoly the tobacco monopoly police. Chinese government had set up virtually a planned economy control system over all of Taiwan's productive life. And the Monopoly Bureau controlled all the retail outlets of people selling cigarettes. But a lot of people were able to do this just simply by paying somebody in the Monopoly Bureau to give them the cigarettes. They would sell it privately. So there was a lot of that attempt to go up to, there were just a lot of Taiwanese people doing that in order to make a living in the hard years right after the surrender of Japan. So when they questioned this woman, and she denied that she was, doing it on a private basis, and they insisted on evidence and roughed her up. The crowd gathered, and then one of the policemen got panicky, according to the interviews that we took around that area and from all the sources that we could find, and pulled out his gun, waved it around, shot, fired off a couple of rounds, and somebody was wounded and eventually died. And that word spread and obviously became a big rumor. And even that same night, there were people gathering in front of the police of the, I think the Tobacco Monopoly Bureau's headquarters, as well as the police headquarters in that part of Taipei. And then next day, the big riots began to take place in Taipei and all around the island. So it was just an ugly affair that just got totally out of control, and people who wanted to escape just stayed indoors and prayed for the best. Well, I can't, because I'd have to go back, and obviously our book is probably very thin on that kind of evidence compared to what is now available if you were to rewrite the history of Urba. If you were going to rewrite the history of a standard history book, I would hope that it would be very much like ours, but have a lot more evidence and be a bigger, thicker book. You can see through my remarks that I strain to be objective in all of this, and that this is not an historical event where one should be making moral judgments. I think you should try to describe what happened, and quote from what people say, and try to get to the ultimate historical truth and complexity of the affair.
Quite a bit of debate over what happened to the mainlanders. I'm trying to get some kind of a number on.
I think that's impossible. I don't think anybody has a clue how many people got beaten up, and maybe the few that were killed. It wasn't too many that got killed. I mean, I hesitate to even put a number out there. But even if you were to put a number out there of several hundred, for a Taiwan society that had known order and nothing of this kind of violence under Japanese rule since 1902, when they suppressed all Taiwan resistance to Japan, that itself would have been a horrific event. If the uprising had just stopped on the second or third or fourth day, and people went back to normal life, that in itself would have been horrific. People were not used to that kind of level of violence. But when people look back 55 years ago and try to recreate that event, and they use numbers and this and that, there's always the tendency to relate those numbers or magnitudes to what you're familiar with today or in the recent past. And then you make your moral judgment or your historical judgment. But I try to operate on the principle that you take a look at the violence at that particular time and you relate it to the 50 years before that it happened to get a sense of how the Taiwanese felt it was horrible, violent, or less excessive. And all I can say is that it was a horrible shock to everybody on those first few days when mainlanders were being picked out for brutal persecution. But that ended, within, I think, about probably, I don't know specifically when it really ended, but I suspect it had well ended before a week had passed, and the resolution committees were doing their work and trying to restore order and set up some kind of communication system so that the elites could decide what Taiwan should do in terms of dealing with Nanjing.
What happened to these resolution committees?
Well, they're all suppressed when the nationalist government sent its troops arrive. In fact, they're arrested. Known leaders of these resolution committees are arrested. And I think they were called Chuli Wei and Hui, I think, in Chinese, these resolution committees. But, brutally suppressed.
Weren't these resolution committees working towards some kind of peaceful resolution?
They were, true, yes, they were. And they were generally run by, I would say, middle-aged, younger people, and modeled upon the kind of way in which people had been governed under the Japanese in the previous decade, before the war began. And that's all the Taiwanese people sort of knew how to organize that kind of group to deal with that kind of new problem that they had never dealt with before. They suddenly found themselves in charge, and generally the resolution committees functioned pretty well to restore order. And given the fact that there was just general chaos and no direction as to what people should take or adopt. The nationalist government officials in all these cities had just disappeared. They didn't appear. They didn't go back to their offices or anything. And as I recall too, I think the books there was very minimal looting, not like the situation that occurred in Iraq. You will recall after we had toppled the government, and that suddenly that binge of looting that occurred. There wasn't that kind of looting. The few looters that may have been doing things were quickly dealt with. There was an attempt of the resolution committees basically to get in touch with Tse-Han, and there was communication between them, but it didn't really lead anywhere. Although there was, as I recall, there was some indication in the second week that they were beginning to agree on some points. Tse-Han wanted them to put their weapons down and go back to their homes and dissolve the resolution committees and so forth, and made very tough, somewhat unrealistic demands, since he wasn't in a position to recover control of the island. He had lost it. And it's interesting that he probably could have suppressed it himself, I think, with the troop strength that he had, although he had sent a lot of troops back to the mainland. But I think his own intelligence and his own decision-making propensity was to play it safe and to consult with his superior, Jiang Jieshi. But I suspect too that Tse-Han was tremendously humiliated by this uprising. It was a big setback for him because he thought he was carrying out local elections and democratizing Taiwan according to Sanminjui principles, and he was already moving ahead with his planned economy to try to revive agriculture and this and that, but going nowhere. I mean, it just didn't work. That's why the inflation got worse and worse in the summer and fall of 46. And finally, his great New Year's address, which I think we translate in the book, paints a bright future for Taiwan as of late January. And it's just on the threshold when this whole place will blow up in his face. So it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And I think any attempt by one group or the other to simply say that the Taiwanese are more responsible or the mainlanders were more responsible doesn't get us very far in terms of understanding the history of that period. Both sides made mistakes, and both sides' mistakes led to elevating passions and bringing about the horrible tragedy that ultimately occurred when that uprising was suppressed. And I think too, you know, there was probably an anger and contempt on the part of the Nanjing government, particularly in Jiang Jie's circles, that you know, how dare they pull this uprising off when we're battling the communists and losing, and we're fighting this horrible civil war that doesn't look good for us. And there was just no orderly rules by which those troops that were sent back were able to get people to get back into their homes and restore law and order in a quick fashion. That is, law and order in terms of the Chinese perception of it, which was all of the representative groups that had automatically been set up in these Taiwan cities would put away their weapons and turn them over to the authorities and go back to their homes. And many, of course, I suppose, feared retribution from the nationalist government from some of the excesses that had occurred on the first week of the uprising. But I see it as just an ugly, complex tragedy that has enabled either side to use whatever way it wants, and that's what happens to historical events when countries become very politically, culturally divided. Unless there's a leader, unless there's a leadership that can really, like a Mandela, you know, for example, who can really saying, look, we've got to have a healing process here. We've got to come back together and figure out a way in which we're going to move forward and try to build our society as we all want to, with security and prosperity. And so far, that leadership has not been forthcoming. Maybe we'll see it at the inauguration speech. I don't know. But if there's going to be a tough rallying cry from the elected administration, that's going to be sad, because both sides will regard this as a standoff and bitterly contest each other into the future. So it depends on leadership, and it has to be good leadership.
The perception is the Taiwanese did not have weapons. What weapons are you referring to? They didn't have guns, did they? Or
Well, when the cities were abandoned by the troops and the police and the militia, a lot of young Taiwanese went into the police stations and took weapons, Now, overall, I don't think, we're not talking about huge stocks of numbers, but certainly there were lots of weapons that filtered into the public domain in the first 3 or 4 days after the affair of February 27th night. In fact, I think the military police in Kaohsiung, that garrison command unit, were sort of surrounded by Taiwanese young men who did have weapons in large numbers and kept them bottled up there. But I think that was the only exception where there was a real standoff in a potentially conflictual way. Excuse me.